Hello and welcome back to Projector at the London Film Festival. If you missed the previous episodes in this series, be sure to catch up with them via the playlist. On this episode, which has a very theatrical theme, Regina King adapts the stage play One Night in Miami, and Pedro Almodóvar and Tilda Swinton team up for The Human Voice. But of course, we start off with One Night in Miami. It is the night of February 25th, 1964, and Cassius Clay, played by Eli Goree, has just won the world title in his bout against Sonny Liston, played by Aaron D. Alexander. In the crowd, a Nation of Islam leader Malcolm X, played by Kingsley ben-adir, NFL star Jim Brown, played by Aldis Hodge, and musician and record producer Sam Cooke, played by Leslie Odom Jr., who celebrate Clay's win by going back to Malcolm X's Hampton House hotel room. There, the four men talk about the huge changes in their respective lives and confront and challenge each other on the examples they set as successful black Americans as they become icons. Regina King has been having a terrific last few years. In 2019, she won the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress for If Beale Street Could Talk. Earlier this year, she won the Emmy for a role in HBO's Watchmen, and now she makes her feature film directorial debut with One Night in Miami, which actually feels a little bit weird to say because King has been behind the camera for a number of years now. She's directed numerous episodes of television, but this is her first film credit. It's also a very notable credit for Kemp, who adapts his own 2013 one-act stage play to the screen, which was highly acclaimed, and it's a big London Film Festival for him, because not only does he have this movie, he's also got the Pixar film Soul, which he co-wrote and co-directed, so he's having a pretty fantastic year as well. One Night in Miami arrives at the London Film Festival with a lot of buzz around it. It premiered at the Venice Film Festival and was notable for being the first film directed by an African-American woman to be selected at that particular festival, and actually it's being primed for a lot of awards contention. Certainly it's considered to be one of the movies that's going to be big at next year's Oscars, whenever that happens. So the question is, does One Night in Miami live up to all that hype? And the answer is sort of, in my opinion. Although the film and the play are fictional, they are inspired by a genuine historical event in that after Clay's victory, he really did go back to a hotel room with Malcolm X, Jim Brown, and Sam Cooke, and the thought of all four of these legends occupying the same space together is a tantalising what if. Obviously, we'll never know what they talked about in that time, but it certainly lends itself to a lot of intriguing dramatic possibilities, and One Night in Miami explores plenty of them. All four of these men are at crossroads in their respective lives and careers. For Cassius Clay, it's considering joining the Nation of Islam and becoming Muhammad Ali. But on the other hand, for Malcolm X, he's actually considering leaving the Nation of Islam, even though he's the one that most talked Ali into it. For Jim Brown, it's considering leaving his NFL career behind to become an actor full-time. And for Sam Cooke, he's considering whether he wants to put more of the black experience into his songwriting. So all four of these men have something to talk about. But what One Night in Miami does that I think makes it so worthy is that it takes these icons and makes them human again. It analyses the decisions and the paths each of them took. And I think that that's an important thing to do, especially with historical figures like this, who can sometimes feel quite distant, especially the likes of Malcolm X and Sam Cooke, who died not long after the events of this movie. And for younger viewers who are aware of them because they're important legacies, it makes them accessible. Seeing them laugh and joke around with each other, the way they rib Malcolm X for his fire and brimstone public persona, as they put it, and his affected speech, knowing that isn't quite how he is in private, it reminds you that they were people. Also, having them all in the same space, they are the most successful black people to have existed at that point in time. Clay just won the world title in boxing, Brown was setting records in the NFL, and Cooke not only owned his own music and was a savvy businessman, but also he owned his own record label. As one of Cooke's songs goes, change is gonna come, which of course naturally plays over the conclusion of this movie, but they're certainly feeling that in different ways. It's of course playing out against the backdrop of the 60s civil rights movement, and they're aware of the fact that they are being offered opportunities that they would have never have gotten up until now, and those are important victories. But there's also more to be done. You see this in the opening sequence of the movie, where Brown visits the home of Mr. Carlton, played by Beau Bridges, who celebrates his accomplishments and seems like an ally right up until he discriminates against him to his face. And in that moment, it's a cruel and brutal reminder that no matter how much someone like Brown accomplishes, some people will only see them for the colour of their skin. And so in that way, they've also got to look out for the next generation. They've got to use the success that they've accrued to uplift other people. And it's there where I think the most tensions within the group lay, as they each have their own different ideas about what that means. And certainly that's the case between Cooke and Malcolm X, who get very, very tense over the course of this movie. Certainly Malcolm X is the most provocative member of the group and certainly tries to challenge all of them in their own different ways. And Malcolm X goes after Cooke in particular because he feels that he isn't really doing enough despite his success. He's not reflecting his experiences in his music, which are largely made up of love ballads that are trying to also court a white audience, something that goes disastrously in the film's opening when Cooke performs the Copacabana to a white crowd who completely reject him. And to really hammer the point home, Malcolm X even pulls out a track by Bob Dylan that he feels is more representative of the black experience than anything Cooke has done, which is certainly a very harsh opinion. But Cooke defends himself by saying that as a businessman, he's done plenty to uplift fellow black artists, and also cites the fact that he's licensed out music by his fellow performers to white acts to cover, and has made huge amounts of money from residuals. Having those arguments and having those debates, it does make the movie actually feel somewhat topical, because those ideas are things that are still being debated right to this day. It's worth remembering that while a lot of films are revisiting the 60s civil rights movement, a lot of it is in reaction to our current political moment. And it does feel like One Night in Miami has a lot to say about where we are right now and how things have changed and how things haven't changed so much in certain respects. The reason why this film is so brilliant are those 4 sensational performances in the lead roles. Virtually all of them are note perfect. Kingsley Ben-adir, Eli Goree, Aldis Hodge, and Leslie Odom Jr. are all fantastic in this movie, and the main reason that is they're not playing caricatures. It's very easy when you're playing a famous or a historical figure to just deliver an impression, to be a collection of tics masquerading as a performance. That never happens in this movie. Every time the actors are on screen, they feel like the person that they are portraying. They genuinely inhabit them in a way that at times is really uncanny. My special favourites are Kingsley Ben-adir as Malcolm X and Eli Goree as Cassius Clay. Goree I wasn't actually familiar with before this film, but he blew me away here. He really inhabits that youthful exuberance of Cassius Clay, that energy and that confidence and that swagger. He really did feel like Ali had come back to life, and the same could be said for Ben-adir as Malcolm X. And what the script does and the actors' performances do is they start with what you know about them and then take them to a level where they're vulnerable and show the layers underneath. This is something that really allows the actors to shine, and shine they do. Lance Reddick also appears as one of the Nation of Islam guards around the door. And you can definitely see why this movie was earmarked for Oscar glory, because honestly, you could fill an entire Best Actor category and award show with just the cast of this movie, 4 of the best performances I've seen all year. They really are absolutely fantastic at every single moment. There is not a missed beat at all. It is a great set of performances that carry virtually the entire movie. But therein lies my problem with One Night in Miami, in that it never felt very cinematic. That's always been my problem with plays adapted to film, in that they always seem to lose something in the adaptation. I think it's because when you're watching a piece of live theatre, the actors are right in front of you. That changes the dynamic they have with the audience. Film is inherently more distant because obviously it's all pre-recorded, and so you've got that barrier there. And this movie never overcomes that barrier. Even with the strength of those performances, it always feels like a dry, talky play that just happens to be on film. And that's not meant to be a criticism of King's direction. I actually think that she's directed this very well, but it's clear that what her priority was to get the absolute best out of the actors. And she did that, but she didn't really open up the material on a visual level, and that's what I felt was quite absent here. A lot of the time the camera is just sort of set up and the actors go for quite long takes. And honestly, after a while, I found myself being quite uninvolved with the action because of it. And I would have thought that if you wanted to get people more interested in the dynamics of this room, you'd get the camera in closer and you try to do some interesting things. But I'd understand why King didn't do that, because obviously that would intrude upon the performances and may even be distracting if it didn't work. It just feels very static, both in terms of location and otherwise, and clearly that was something that Kemp Powers was very much aware of when he was writing his screenplay, because he's tried to expand out the scope. He's added scenes at the beginning and ending of the film to try and show where each of these people were prior to their encounter, and then how they responded afterwards. And in isolation, these scenes do work, especially the closing sequence, and certainly I think that these show King's direction from a filmmaking point of view at her strongest. I think that she does show a cinematic eye there that the bulk of the film doesn't. But unfortunately, they do feel like bolt-ons for the most part. It feels like prologue and epilogue rather than really being attached to the main chunk of the movie, and doesn't really resolve the problem with adapting the play to film in the first place. So there's a bit of a frustrating push and pull here, in that you appreciate the fantastic performances, but I felt they only really made up for so much. One Night in Miami is definitely a movie we're going to be talking about come awards season. The performances are phenomenal, and all of them are likely to end up being nominated, and probably should be. I think that King shows a lot of promise as a director, and I think that Kemp Powers' script definitely has a lot to say. I think that there will be people that will very much enjoy this movie. The problem is that I just didn't think it was very much of a film, so much as just filmed theatre. I think that in that way, it held me back from fully appreciating it, even though there is a lot to recommend about it. And as such, I think it does really show the limitations of bringing something from the stage to film, even with all the best talent in the world. One Night in Miami will be released in cinemas on Christmas Day, and then released by Amazon on their Prime Video platform in January. Next up, a very quick look at Pedro Almodóvar's new short, The Human Voice. An unnamed woman, played by Tilda Swinton, waits restlessly in her apartment, awaiting a phone call from her lover of 4 years and the end of their relationship. Over the course of the call, we get a glimpse into the woman's unstable state of mind. The Human Voice is based on Jean Cocteau's 1930 play of the same name, something which has inspired Pedro Almodóvar for many years, going all the way back to his 80s hit Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, and this short actually marks the very first thing that Pedro Almodóvar has directed in the English language. It also provides something of a hint at what filmmaking will be like under the time of COVID, as this was shot in July 2020 in Spain. So if you're wondering what the film is like, it's extremely minimalist. It's basically Tilda Swinton, and almost exclusively one set. And I do mean one set. What's interesting about the staging of this short is that for the most part it takes place in the woman's apartment, but it's clearly a set on a soundstage. In fact, the very first thing we see is Tilda Swinton actually walking around the soundstage, and during the short, she actually walks freely around it and out of it as well. So not only does she walk around the apartment, she also walks around the back of the stage. That's meant to be a cheeky nod to its theatrical origins, but it also serves to illustrate how the relationship, while seemingly perfect, is artificial and constructed, and as you would expect from Almodóvar, that set looks absolutely gorgeous. It looks extremely colourful and stylish in a way that's extremely evocative and instantly recognisable as one of his films. Like the play that it's based on, this is very much about communication, or lack thereof, because of course it centres around a phone call where we only ever hear one side of the conversation. There is obviously meant to be an absence there from the fact that we can't hear the man on the other side, and so we only have to infer from the woman's reactions to what he says and to what she says in return. What's interesting about this movie is that obviously in comparison to the stage version, this is updated so that Swinton is actually carrying on the conversation on her AirPods. So unlike the play, she's not tethered to a phone, she's freely walking around in conversation, which actually makes it feel a lot more open and quite cinematic in combination with the staging. And that technological element makes the play feel very relevant, even if we're being honest, a guy this cowardly probably wouldn't actually phone her to separate, he'd probably just dump her via a text message. But even so, it does also feel like a reflection of the current COVID-19 crisis in certain respects, because obviously we've got this extremely minimalist staging, but also the fact that many people have had to communicate via technology these days, so that feeling of separation and anxiety and waiting for a lover to show up feels very, very much of our present moment. As with the original play, this is very much a showcase of performance. Cocteau wrote the original in response to his actors claiming that his previous plays were too plot-driven, and this is very much a showcase for Tilda Swinton, who I probably don't even need to tell you is brilliant here. She plays the woman's fractured state of mind so expertly, the way that she's so insecure and anxious, her jealousy and frustration building up into moments of just pure unbridled rage. Early on, she buys an axe from a hardware store that she uses to attack her lover's empty suit on the bed, and it's that which makes her such a volatile, unpredictable presence that you can't take her eyes off her throughout the entirety of the short. She runs through so many different emotions throughout the running time, and just watching all of Swinton's micro expressions as she listens to the other end of the line. Almodóvar's camera often gets very close in those moments so you can really absorb them. It just shows how phenomenal Swinton is as a performer, and Swinton carries this short so confidently across its 30-minute running time. I was so completely engaged with it that it just absolutely flew by, and I easily would have watched an entire 90 minutes of just Swinton on this one set alone, which really goes to show how much the combination of Almodóvar and Swinton has worked out here. The Human Voice will play in UK cinemas this November. If you like these reviews from LFF and want to support my work, then you can do so over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.